You're listening to the Vacation Rental Key with T&T, the podcast for vacation rental managers by vacation rental managers. I'm Tim Cafferty, and I manage two companies, one in Virginia and one in North Carolina. And I'm one of the two T's.
And I'm the other T, Tiffany Edwards, born and raised in the vacation rental business. I help manage our family businesses from Key West all the way to Kauai.
In the next 30 minutes, we're going to give you our keys to success in the vacation rental business. Welcome back to the Vacation Rental Key with T&T. I'm Tim, and today we're cutting through the noise on the single biggest threat to your portfolio in 2026, the regulatory shift. If you think the rules from last year still apply, you're already behind. We aren't just talking about simple bans anymore, folks. We are talking about the bedroom tax. Just this week, San Diego made national headlines as a controversial proposal for an $8,000 annual flat tax on vacation homes was narrowly defeated at City Hall. But don't breathe too easy. It's a signal of what's coming to a market near you. From Norfolk's new bedroom per night fees to Virginia Beach's new per night fees to California's automated enforcement that's using AI to catch unpermitted units in real time, the honor system is dead. Today, we're breaking down why your revenue strategy and your regulatory compliance are now the same thing. We are fortunate to have an expert on this subject. She's a lobbyist. She's a political marketing strategist. She's a fundraising specialist, development council treasurer, and the executive director of the Florida Professional Vacation Rental Coalition. And she happens to be my co-host. Please welcome Tiffany Edwards.
You know, Tim, I love that introduction. It's been y'all, we've started this podcast a year, and every week I'm like, maybe we could talk about regulations. So if you don't know me outside of this podcast, regulations, legislation, I love it. And so I am so excited today, the beginning of a new year, to really talk because, Tim, as you mentioned, the game has changed in terms of legislation. After COVID, we saw this huge proliferation of vacation rentals, and we saw local communities try to ban or cap. Those days, they're not completely over, but municipalities, states, local governments are all trying to find other ways to regulate. And a lot of us are not paying attention to things that could be massive risks. So today we're going to outline 5 of what I believe are the top 5 legislative or ordinance trends for 2026.
You have put this beautifully, and we're going to get into this one by one. The first one really goes back to what I was setting up. Local municipalities are looking for financial resources. They don't have the money they need. And what a great opportunity. Let's tax some people who aren't voters.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I think a lot of people forget is that elected officials are responsible to their constituents. They're also the individuals they hear from the most, right, when they're angry. And they look at visitors as not constituents. They look at homeowners or second homeowners as not constituents. And so it's much easier to utilize that as a revenue pool because they're not directly taxing those constituents. And one thing that's really important is that last year we saw in most of the states, Colorado being one, Idaho being one, California is suggested to be at a $17 billion budget deficit this year. All of these communities and all these states are going to have to try to find funds. And how do they do that, right? So they're going to do that through several different revenue sources. One, we're going to start seeing increased permit fees. All right. So what you had before, expect it to double, potentially triple in what those fees are going to be. The other thing we're going to start to see are fines increase dramatically. And some of these, you really need to understand that they'll add on additional costs. So you may have a fine, but now they'll add on an administrative cost associated with that fine to review and a magistrate cost. So you're going to start to see more and more of that. You're also going to see from a state level if your tourism tax is specifically regulated. So, Tim, in North Carolina, your tourism tax is regulated. It has to be spent, or a significant amount has to be spent on actual tourism and marketing. Same for Florida. We're going to see some legislation that tries to broaden that spend for general budget. We're going to see general increases in taxes. And a couple years back, we saw in Colorado where there was a proposal being discussed for commercial taxation on residential properties that were being utilized as short-term rentals. So a lot of those are going to be coming down the pipeline pretty aggressively. Most states' revenues do not support their increased expenses. And that's not unique. Even in Florida, where we have a balanced budget, they're unable to keep up with the aging population as well as the Medicaid cost. And so they're going to be looking for ways to help cover that balanced budget.
So when you look at those financial deficits you're talking about, it's the growth, right? Not only the spending growth, but the base of their communities that's growing. And the economy's really stagnant if you look at the numbers closely. So they have to look for new sources of income. And this seems like low-hanging fruit. Is that about the crux of it?
Absolutely. And I think it'll be the number one trend for 2026. The other thing that we've seen is that tourism really hasn't slowed down, and tourism taxes are still coming in. There's still a significant amount of interest for vacation rentals as an accommodation option. And so this amount of money is pretty stable from a state or a local jurisdiction perspective. So it is something that they can rely on as a revenue source. Now, one thing that you should be doing is you need to know if your state has experienced some type of financial deficit, right? Have they started borrowing? Are they showing lower revenue numbers for their sales tax at the state level? Are you a balanced budget area? And then two, has that trickled down to your local jurisdiction where your vacation rental or your short-term rental is regulated? That is going to be an indicator of what is to come for you. The other thing you need to look at is that if you have a permitting or licensing, is that done in a resolution or fee? So a resolution at a local jurisdiction is done usually once a year. It's done in all the fees for your licensing is done at one time. So it can be hidden, and it's not something that you necessarily pay attention to until your annual license is up for renewal.
One of the things I like to try to do is understand where the other side, if you will, is coming from. And I understand that some of the least of these revenue sources are going to things that are hard to argue with, like workforce housing and homelessness. I think Washington State and San Diego are suggesting that their per bedroom taxes are going to be completely dedicated to housing. Difficult to be against that, particularly when some blame the vacation rental industry on creating a housing issue. How do you see that?
That is a direct tie conversation that most opposition to vacation rentals have. I think it's important to remember that vacation rentals, short-term rentals are not the causation of housing affordability. We have had a decrease of construction coming into the market. In fact, at this point in time, from my studies and research, at about 7 years, it would take about 7 years for construction to meet the actual demand. So, especially in places that are heavy tourism driven, you are limited in your geographic. So, and it's highly sought after. So, there's going to be a housing affordability issue because there are a lot of people who want to have a home in those areas. However, it is always important to carry a narrative of compromise. So if there is an opportunity for some of this money to go to help in the community, housing affordability, I totally agree with. But you need to make sure that that money is accounted for and that there's some type of reporting structure so that it doesn't become a black hole into the general fund when no workforce housing or affordable housing accommodations are made from this revenue stream.
Yeah, here on the Outer Banks, we've been trying to grapple with this housing shortage, and we had a task force, housing task force, if you will, that was created. That has now been moved into a housing authority, and it's a 501(c). So I can see this happening just like it's already being constructed. So you're on point there. But what about our response as vacation rental managers? What should we be thinking about as we move into this area?
Should definitely be getting involved in having these conversations with elected officials. This is an election year. This is going to be something that they continue to talk about. It will be a major talking point because a lot of constituents are feeling the burden, especially again in these tourism driven markets that are unable to enter into affordable housing because there's such a limited amount. So you need to be having these conversations. You need to understand, is there any type of incentive program for workforce housing? Is there any capability for workforce housing? And then talk through what some potential solutions would be. If there's already a housing authority, having someone from your company or having yourself represented there is really important. But again, I also try to reference as much as possible, and VRMA with Oxford Economics did a study on this that we helped to do about 2 years ago, of really understanding the causation of what housing affordability is. And so your involvement in housing affordability is as a community partner and not, again, as the causation of housing affordability, but
Yeah,
this a helpful solution.
excellent. So we've established the financial deficits and they exist, and we hear what's happening with the municipalities. It makes some sense if you think it through. And we now have a response. So I think that covers bullet point number one. Number two is interesting as we look at those investors and the corporate interest as it relates to this regulation thing.
Yeah, so this even ties into that housing affordability conversation. So we've been painted over the last several years as corporate greed, right? Because people don't necessarily understand the industry. They think of this huge corporation coming in and buying up all this inventory and making all kinds of money on the backs of the local community. And so it's really important to make sure that the narrative is that you are local within the community and that you believe in that character of community. And that's why you've invested in the community and you take advantage of your property and you want to be able to take advantage of your property. That's why you're renting it short term and not long term. And it's really also important to understand, and I've referenced this many times before, but Tavern Research for the Searchlight Institute actually came out with a study last year. And landlords with 1 to 50 properties control 95% of all inventory, and entrepreneurial activities is not a corporate one. And so, really identifying because you'll see a lot of your owners, if you're a property manager, are under LLCs. So, explaining that that is due to liability and not corporate takeover is very important to discuss with elected officials, but also make sure that the community understands and drawing in that personal connection.
For his part, President Trump weighed in on this just a few weeks ago and saying that we should have a national ban on these big companies coming in. A little bit of a confusion there on that. Nobody's against that, right? But
Right.
he's really doing a broad brush stroke that's unfair to these folks. You have some amazing statistics on who's actually buying and what's happening.
Yeah, in 2025, the second quarter, 60% of investor sales went to traditional home buyers. 33% of all home purchases, investors were because buyers had, I'm sorry, 33% of all home purchases of investors were because traditional buyers had pulled back due to mortgage rates. And so that's something that, is all over the country. And Tim, we're seeing legislation at a state level, probably more in Hawaii than in any other state, about trying to ban these quote unquote investors and limitations on how many second homes or non-homestead homes you can have. And I do think that we'll see that legislation throughout the country. I don't necessarily see it passing to many places, but that conversation continues to create a narrative that we are the problem and we're this unknown entity that does not care about the community.
So again, we've identified the issue. What should the response be, particularly for those listening and maybe seeing this podcast?
Yeah. So again, you need to communicate that, lead with the local mindset. Even if you're not there all the time, you believe in preserving the character of the community and being a good steward of the community, and you appreciate the local characteristic of that community. You need to know, if you're a property manager, when to engage the owners or your owners. So I like to think of being as proactive as possible, of communicating what's going on with your homeowners, but not having them engage until very end. And part of that is because a lot of these elected officials don't consider them constituents. And it's very difficult to tie their narrative to someone who is hurting from a housing perspective. Again, communicate that LLC, and making sure that you define that if it is an LLC, that is an individual named for that LLC. So it's not this massive corporation. And then you also need to discourage language in any ordinance that has a permitting requirements that includes language that says additional requirements by department for that permitting process, because that gives the opportunity for any administrator of your land planning, of your code compliance, wherever your permits are held, your revenue, to add in any additional requirements that you will be unaware of. So that's something that's really important. And then the other thing I would tell you to do is go ahead right now and go to your local jurisdiction and sign up or register for agendas and read through, or have someone from your group read through those agendas to make sure you're on the agenda at any given time.
I love that pro tip there that you gave right in the middle about looking for the term of additional requirements by department. It sounds just like a carte blanche, as they used to say, to do what they wish in the future.
Yeah. And it happens more often than not, Tim. So I would say that most people don't realize that that's actually already a part of your ordinance. So be
So
aware.
but we have a podcast here for vacation rental managers. I wonder sometimes if there's a legislative podcast somewhere that they're getting this stuff because it's spreading like wildfire. They definitely have their sources and they share that information. So I think you're going to caution us in this next section, item number 3, in that litigation may not be the right course. Although we have seen a lot of litigation, Airbnb particularly comes to mind and some others, but talk to us about the litigation outcomes that you've seen.
Yeah. So litigation is in the last year and will grow, I believe, even more so this year. And it's really driven by two different things. One, that local elected officials are so tired from this conversation and being beaten up from both sides, because this is one of the most contentious issues for a lot of these elected officials, that at some point, and I've talked to several elected officials through different ordinance writing, that they'd just rather go to court to deal with it. And so we're at a point, and we started at a point, you've seen it in Dallas, you saw it in Austin, you saw it in South Lake Tahoe, you saw it in New Orleans, where they just kind of throw things up and they wait for litigation to work it all out.
They must feel like they're dealing from a position of strength if they have that attitude, right?
You would think, but I think at sometimes they are so far removed from the actual consequences of what's in place in terms of damages or the cost for attorneys to
Right.
drag this on. I was once given the advice a long, long time ago that your goal should always be to compromise. When you first go in on an ordinance or even at a state legislature, figure out what your non negotiables are and be willing to compromise with some concessions, because litigation does not mean you're necessarily going to win, and it is hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah. Sounds
And
like
in
a
most
sounds
oh,
like a
go ahead.
day in the life of a vacation rental manager dealing with a disgruntled guest, right?
Yeah, chargebacks.
Yes, indeed. Boy.
Yeah, so we're going to see a lot of that. The other thing is that you had mentioned Airbnb's been pretty involved. They've we've also seen that a lot of local alliances have had no other choice but to litigate because most of the policies shut down all operations.
Wow. So again, a vacation rental manager who may be involved in this, maybe they are involved in going to the housing authority meetings and talking to their local folks and whatever. What other kinds of things should they be using as resources if and when litigation seems apparent?
Yeah. So one thing you need to do is try to research any former court cases in your state. Every state has former cases. The other thing you need to be able to understand is to what degree your local jurisdiction can actually legislate your industry. So for Florida, we have preemption. We're one of the states where all regulations of those vacation rentals or short-term rentals are regulated to the state, and local municipalities cannot ban or regulate frequency or duration. But we passed a couple years ago legislation, which is a little unique, and I would suggest for any state to look at this. But what it does is that if a local jurisdiction, if an ordinance is placed, it creates harm to a local business. That local business has the ability to sue the government. And what it does is it creates a freeze on that ordinance. So essentially, almost an injunction. And then it quote unquote rocket dockets, meaning that a judge has to hear
Mm.
the court or has to hear that case and make a decision. So what it does is that it doesn't create that loophole where you have years of litigation and meanwhile all the businesses go under. And so there are states that you need to research to see, is this something that they are actually able to do, and meaning they, local jurisdictions. The other thing you need to understand too is that any litigation response, good, bad, or indifferent, really becomes a permanent ordinance because no one wants to go through it again. It's very expensive, and then the courts have spoken. So it really holds your ordinance into place. And then I would also say, too, look at other states and see what their case studies have been. So even if you don't have the same type of state authority over vacation rentals or short term rentals, you still could have court cases and look at those and try to mirror language that would be beneficial for your community.
Wow. I wonder about I get the good legislation, the bad legislation. I don't know about the indifferent. So I just was just thinking there as we
Well,
moved into
indifferent means that there's losers. So you've lost and the other
yes.
side has lost. So it's a
Oh,
complete
okay.
balance. No one's happy,
I get it.
right?
Okay.
That's what every elected official tries to say. But I don't believe in no one's happy. I like to be content. I
Okay.
don't want to be, I know I'm never going to be truly over thrilled, but I'll settle for content.
Good. The fourth on your 5 top trends here talks about one of your favorite sayings, bad actors. The days of flying under the radar are officially over. There are new laws like California's SB 346. It takes effect this month, where the state mandates data sharing. So facilitators like Airbnb, they're now legally compelled in many states to share physical addresses, URLs, booking frequency with local tax agencies quarterly. And so these bad actors, we need to be strong against that, I think is where you're going with this.
Yeah, bad actor accountability we're going to see for this year more than ever so before. And part of that is because almost every local jurisdiction has some type of monitoring software. They also have built in some type of regulatory department or someone in code compliance that starts to review most of these listings. And so they've gotten a lot smarter on how they catch some of these quote unquote bad actors. Now, what I think is so important, and I've personally just this week had to deal with a code compliance issue, but it's so important that you make sure that you differentiate yourself from what a quote unquote bad actor is. And even if you make a mistake based on what is required by an ordinance, you need to make sure that you overemphasize how much you are trying to stay in compliance, that some of these are clerical issues. One of the things that is really lost in translation on a localized level, especially for property managers, is that code compliance and these departments don't realize that we actually channel our listings out through our software. So our property management software, we have several different stops before those changes go into place because we integrate everything. A lot of local officials or people within land planning just think that you have one individual who goes in and just makes those changes right away. And that's not necessarily the case. So there are some type of clerical. You also need to make sure, and I suggest again that you go and read your ordinance, but that there's some type of magistrate process, right? So if you are at some point in time not compliant with something that's in an ordinance, then you need to make sure that you have an opportunity to cure that instead of it automatically being fined. That is really, really important. So it gives you some opportunity to differentiate yourself from that bad actor.
So ensure you're compliant. If you have permit numbers, make sure they're clearly displayed and just understand it's no longer a manual check on the city staffer, it's an algorithm. But to expand on that, I don't think you have this on your dialogue, but I'm seeing this on homeowner associations as well, making sure you're a good citizen there. I have a subdivision literally behind this window, those looking on YouTube. It's a subdivision that they have a new management company, and they've decided that the signs that we're putting up aren't compliant. We're taking them down today. I'm not going to argue. I'm going to do what I can do to be a good citizen. So being proactive on that helps the overall, I think, as well.
Yeah. And in most states, homeowners associations and those covenants oversee what a state or local jurisdiction. So they can be a lot more restrictive. And those are additional fines there. So you really need to make sure that you're in the good graces with the homeowners association. And you also need to understand, is it a majority or super majority where they can ban short-term or vacation rentals in your area? And one of the things, Tim, that I also need to mention is that a lot of people don't realize that if you are not just on an OTA, an online travel agent, and if you're a property manager, a lot of times by definition, you are also a listing site because your website actually markets and is a travel agent. And while we don't think of it that way, by definition, most local ordinances or states do identify it that way. So there may be additional things that you're required to do.
Good tip. Fantastic. Okay. I think we're down to the end here, and we have this highlighted as high impact validation. Talk to us about that. What does that mean?
So this is, again, my crystal ball, what I think of 2026 with my 20 plus years of lobbying and vacation rental experience. So this is the first time that we're seeing a growing connection between high impact, so environmental and tourism, being a causation narrative. Now, I'm not saying that that is causation, that is related. But what I'm saying is that we're seeing validation of that being an issue. So California, the Coastal Commission now is tying it together. We've seen in Hawaii that last year, the green fee, which was an increase in their tourism tax to help offset the environmental impacts of tourism, being added from a state perspective. So there's more conversation over the hype of sustainable tourism and especially impacts to national parks, resources. We're looking at North Carolina and Florida, beach erosion being a massive concern and issue. So there are going to be more conversations. And the way that we'll see some of this is through, again, additional taxes, occupancy limitations, more aggressive occupancy limitations. We're going to see limitations on duration. So, how often someone can come rent and for how long.
Mm. I'm seeing that as well on the homeowner association side. When you have parking issues, noise violations, over occupancy, I'm seeing homeowners association actually immediately suspending access to amenities such as pools and things like that. So people are taking this very seriously. What's the thing? Occupancy, parking, and noise, and maybe garbage as well, maybe 4. But those are the hot points for pretty much across the board on this stuff. So that is very, very interesting.
Yeah,
What
and
else?
we're even seeing in Panama. So, for an example, in Panama City Beach, we're having major safety issues during really high season. So, 4th of July, Memorial Day weekend, spring break. They were seeing some gun violence issues. They were seeing a lot of issues with teens and overcrowding and loitering. And so they went and ahead and passed very swiftly a high impact ordinance where it requires for minors, a limitation on minors during that time who are not relatives of the main renter or the responsible adult of the party. There are also requirements from a property manager that has to keep the records so that police jurisdictions have access to those records. And then there's curfews associated. So all of those things fall in line to a property manager or a host to disseminate that information to your renters, but during those specific times or 24 hours after the local jurisdiction, Panama City Beach, has announced it as a high impact time. So there's additional responsibilities there as well.
Oh, it makes sense. I actually rented a property in that jurisdiction you were talking about. And when I rented, the company got back to me and said, I need to know the name of every person. And if you would please provide an identification for each one.
Mhm.
So it's coming back to the professional property manager to enforce that. So, wow. Okay. High impact validation. So, what else are you watching? So, we kind of covered the 5 areas that we outlined here. But what else are you watching as we look at 2026?
So I'm continuing to watch those active court cases. There's one in Monterey County, which I'm particularly interested in, but I think overall for California is interesting because they have a California Coastal Commission that was set up to allow for affordable accommodations and access to the coast. For the first time in their decision with Monterey County, they decided that short term rentals were not an affordable accommodation and they didn't allow an outright ban, but they did allow bans in certain areas and limitations, which we hadn't particularly seen before. I'm also really interested to see what the multifamily construction to condo conversion looks like. In the last 2 years, there was a massive build across the country of multifamily complexes very close to tourism destinations. And we're seeing that a lot of those have not been able to fill. A lot of people are not moving into those multifamily, and those mortgages are still there for the developers. So I'm interested to see what the condo conversion is going to be. That will be a major issue for us because it will be overpopulated for the area and not what the intent is for those high impact timeframes. I am also really monitoring alternative legislation. So last year in Florida, we had a bill that came up that we watched. It did not say vacation rental, it did not say short term rental. What it did is say hybrid housing, and it was housing that acted like a rental, and it
Mhm.
allowed local governments to zone those out. So at no point in time did it reference vacation rentals, but it would have gotten rid of our preemption had that gone in place.
Wow. How about the interest that we're seeing from the big guys, OTAs? I think about Expedia and the fact that they're embracing vacation rentals more on their platform. Is that a good thing or could that be a problem for us?
So the reason why I think that Personally, I think it's great for our businesses because there's so much more, it will grow so much more demand out there, and it opens us up to another traveler that maybe hasn't had the same type of understanding of our industry or feel safe to go stay in a home. However, what it does is it puts us more in direct competition with hotels in specific areas. And because it is another alternative accommodation, some people may choose to do that as opposed to take a hotel trip at a resort in some of these destinations. So what I will say is that as that grows, we'll start to see more commercial legislation, meaning legislation at a state level, which identifies short-term or vacation rentals as commercial property. What that looks like sneaky wise is fire sprinklers, fire safety systems, evacuation requirements, inspection requirements that are more on the commercial side as opposed to a residential side. But that'll happen more at a state level because the hotel associations are more organized and have better lobbying at the state level.
Well, it could also impact things like your electric rates, your insurance, and just a multitude of things. How they look at commercial versus residential is a completely
Yeah.
different animal. Wow, that's fantastic. You tell she's excited about this, folks. Welcome to February. You think it's cold out there, but she's hot today, boy. We are on this. Good stuff.
If you're watching, I got my glasses on. I'm ready. I'm ready. And the other thing I always try to tell people, because it always sounds so Debbie Downer as a, advocacy, but there are several necessary checkpoints for an ordinance or state legislation to go through. So you have to go through hearings, usually 2 different times. For most of our vacation or short-term rentals on a local jurisdiction, you're in land planning. So that's 2 separate meetings in land planning. Then it usually goes to 2 separate public hearings into a county or municipality jurisdiction, and then still has to be signed and implemented. So there are plenty of opportunities for you to get your input in that process. And then the other thing is too, is we haven't had an election yet. Go start meeting your candidates. If there's someone you think that would be really great to fill that position, go encourage them to run. We have the opportunity to put more candidates in office that are friendlier to our industry, and it starts now.
All right, so we covered our top 5 trends, if you will, towards this regulation and regulatory compliance. We talked about financial deficits of the municipalities and even the states, investor and corporate interest. We talked about litigation and those outcomes. We talked about bad actor accountability and the new term for me, high impact validation. And I made particular note on that. Maybe you can do like me. Those of you on video saw that I was sipping on something when I was listening to Tiffany and taking notes. Maybe you should go back, listen to this again and sip on something and take notes about what you heard today. So fantastic. Anything else we missed?
Let us know.
Yes, hit that. Hey, give us a good rating as well. Look at that little icon in the corner. Give us a thumbs up or a 5-star review, if you will. It helps us know that we're doing a good job and may get to more people out there as well. So don't forget that part of it. Hey, next time, I am really excited. We have I will say, worldwide expert on booking patterns and trends, and we'll be hearing about what's happening so you can plan accordingly. So that's coming up in less than 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to it. I know you are as well. Another keynote-worthy speaker, by the way. So we'll keep you on the edge of your seat until that time.
Yeah, can't wait. Thank you for listening to All Advocacy. If you've made it through, share this episode with other people within the industry, because we can't make change or prevent any of these negative regulations if we're not all talking from the same talking points.
I think your predictions here are going to be better than our predictions episode, by the way. I just want to put that on the record. I think you nailed it. So super job. Until next time. So long, everybody.
Bye, guys. Thanks.